that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Yes.
Have you ever been in the Parkin House in Friendsville?
Yeah.
The stories go that sometime between 1760 and 1810, it was built. It was a marble house, almost identical to the house that
Colonel Ramsey's house.
Had a limestone.
Okay, yes.
And it's been redone. I looked at it, luckily I didn't get it. Because somebody started redoing the windows, put aluminum windows in. So which means you had to go back to the
Right.
But it probably goes back to the 1780s.
Yeah, there's still a lot of, and that was what really surprised me back when I remember I said earlier that I was told by some of the specialists that knew Tennessee historic buildings said that there were no 18th century buildings left in the state of Tennessee. I was really confused about that and then really hard to accept it after I had seen so many early log buildings. But once again, people that are older than you at the time, you think they're smarter than you and they think they know more. But once again, history is a developing, learned type of education. And so we learn things differently than we may have learned earlier in our lives or stories that we had heard earlier. And I probably should have started this presentation with a statement saying, these are totally my beliefs and things, and not necessarily that of the management. These things that I've told you today, these are things that I've experienced and what I believe to be true, but not necessarily. Is it always going to be true? Yes, ma'am.
For the ladies, I want to add one thing. When we say we built this house and put it back together, Ben and I and our 3 daughters would go on the weekend, and I am not a manual labor of any kind, and we would go and sit up on those logs and break that stuff out, and the way we got them to do it was they could eat anywhere they wanted when we went home. And they stood between 2 car doors with a towel over it. Everybody got 1 gallon of water. So you poured over 1 gallon of water so you'd be clean enough to go somewhere to eat. And you've got just story after story like that they're experiences that, to me, now the girls go, well, that's no big deal. But it is.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yes.
You restored this house.
Yes.
Basically, you disassembled the logs and you
Yes.
trucked them to the new location.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reminded of the fact that before they gave up on reconstructing the Lucinda Ogle cabin / house, that I think the last budget to do that was like $1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I have remarked that when the house was built, it was built by 2 men and a mule. And again, that's just based on an experience I had growing when I was a pre-teenager in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And so you did all that, and you had a wife and 2 daughters, I guess.
3. One teenager and the 2 others weren't even teenagers.
Instead of a mule.
Yeah.
Instead of a mule, I had a 60-foot crane,
I resent that,
a bobcat, and a
Yeah. But so was it just your family that did this, or did you have?
I had some friends that would help me.
Friends.
Yeah.
But we had no professional,
Okay. No professional.
except him.
And that's why it didn't cost you $1.5
Well, I'm not sure it didn't.
No, it only cost us $20 a time for a meal.
Yes.
So one of the other differences are something that I had never seen in a cabin. Lucinda's ceiling structure was effectively sapling. I think it was stuff that was 2 and 3 inches in diameter.
Round holes.
Round holes.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, it was, I don't know what the original structure was. I assume it was oak, split oak.
Now you're speaking of the Ogle cabin that's in the park.
No, it's in a termite pile now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the Ogle cabin was on the Lucinda Ogle cabin was on the boundary of the park. It was disassembled and stored, I guess, about 20 years ago, with the idea that it would be reconstructed somewhere, and it was stored improperly, and so all that's left is, I think they just like salvaged like 3 logs out of it or something.
Yeah, and that's very unfortunate, and that had happened so often.
Yeah. But were there a lot of homes that were constructed with the pole?
Yes. There, builders are, just like today, houses are built of certain levels of complexity. That's the right word to say. And there would have been no exception at that point in time. The ability of the builder at that time, he would have done what he could do with his available help at hand. One of the things that I did want to point out, though, is these large log buildings that are still some of the earliest buildings, when we knew that they did not have any kind of technology that we have today to build anything. They had no power tools, they had no of those kinds of implements, that it would be very difficult for one person to go into the forest and cut these trees down and build such a structure by himself. These buildings were built by professionals, and there were lots of professionals on the frontier, along with those farmers and pioneers that came in here. As I said earlier, all of them were skilled at some level of work. Either they were merchants, or they were brick masons or stone masons, or timbermen or foresters or potters, or some kind of craft guild they were doing, because they had to make a living. They had to make a living. You come in and just be a subsistence farmer and live, you still have to have other things. And if you don't have time to make them yourselves, you've got to purchase them. And so you have to have some kind of trade to produce a product that you can trade for, to get the things that you don't have time to make yourself. A lot of our early history components that we read about the pioneers is that they made everything from the shoes they wore to the houses they lived in. The combs they brushed their hair with, they made. Those things could be possible, but was it the norm? And I feel personally that wasn't the norm. By the time Tennessee becomes a part of a living area for the Europeans, then those services and products were available for them to purchase, but they had to trade for them. There wasn't a lot of tender money like pocket money that we've had today, but they had services that they could trade for. As a matter of fact, some of articles that are in the early papers by William King, who was one of the first ironmongers in the Tennessee area, he's producing, working the salt areas to provide salt, but he also has iron furnaces to provide iron for blacksmiths and for trade. And in trade for those kinds of things, he's also trading back feathers so people may have ducks or geese. And so he would take in feathers for other products that he could sell at his stores. And so, or garden goods, he could take in garden goods, eggs, those kinds of things he would take in for something that they could not provide themselves. And that was by the late 1700s he's actually doing this. He's running articles in the paper.
Cool.
Yes.
The carpentry work that you did on restoring that is quite an accomplishment. Did you also do the masonry work? And
Yes.
How long did that take? What the size of that chimney?
No, I take that back. I did not do the chimney work. I did the other masonry work, the other foundation work, but not the chimney work. I had a masonry company do that, a stone masonry do that.
That's quite a feat.
Up there.
Yeah, that's-
I noticed that one of the slides had a cabin with a brick fireplace.
Mhm.
Yes.
Isn't that sort of out of keeping with the date?
Not at all.
Some places were making brick by the mid 1700s,
Yeah.
and so you can have a house made in 1760 and a brick chimney on it.
As
But
it
the
is-
brick will be handmade.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in Williamsburg, Virginia, most of the houses, the earlier houses in Williamsburg were built to frame. Well, they started having so many fires. There was an edict made by the middle of the 1700s that they could not build any more frame structures in Williamsburg. They had to be a brick or stone masonry, and that's by the mid-1700s.
But that's civilization, that's not East Tennessee.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say is, Jonesboro was civilization by
Yes,
1770.
There
I
were,
don't think there's any brick chimneys in the park, those are all rock chimneys.
Well, now you're dealing with a
Right.
different time period,
Yeah.
again, and a different isolated area.
No,
but
he's
if you
not.
had a community with, say, 30 families in this community, you might find brick in that. There would be someone had those skills, would make a kiln and start making brick.
And then one last question, what kind of wood is that shut wall? You know?
This is
Oh.
pine.
Yeah.
This is pine.
So it's not chestnut?
No.
They were all made with it?
No. Most of the types of wood that we see in the early structures are pine. And it's a type of hard, long-leaf pine that we see. It's not the white pine or the jack pine that we see a lot left in Tennessee. But these were very tall trees that grew very straight and very tall. It took very long for them to grow. So the growth rings are very close together, several rings to the inch, which makes it a much denser wood, much more stable wood. One of the things I didn't talk about too was cutting down a tree. If any of you are timber people, you will know that if you cut down a green tree, how long does it take for it to become stable? Several years. It takes an inch per year for it, a year per inch of thickness of wood for it to become stable. And so therefore, how much weight does it lose, as well as how much physical mass does it lose when it starts drying out? At 50%, it will lose probably several inches in size. If you put a green log into a log wall and you chink and daub it, what's going to happen to the daubing?
You gotta re-chink it.
You got to re-chink it until it dries out. Well, but once again, I showed you a building that was built in the 1700s that still has its original daubing in it. So those logs could not have been totally green when the log house maker built that building. And there's a technique that we recently discovered, that I've recently discovered, of how timber were harvested. And I saw this on a video that was being done over in Norway. That was a technique that they had used in Norway for hundreds of years of how they harvested their trees. They didn't just go to cut the tree down. They ringed the tree originally. And they ringed the tree in the fall of the year, and that allowed the sap not to continue to come up the tree and help the tree to dry out. This image right here, this is a period drawing, and it's hard to see this. I might have blown it up. I just put it in this collage. But you see these little stalks sticking up here. These are trees that have died around this log house settlement because they have been ringed. And they're waiting for those trees to die before they cut them down, which gives them a head start on the logs being dried before they hew them out and put them in a log building. So that's another part of this story that we don't really have a good handle on, because we know that using green lumber in a building such as this, a log building, is problematic. Now you can use green lumber in timber frame structures, because you can adjust your notching and those sorts of things, but in a log building, the way it's constructed becomes problematic. And so that's another area that we're beginning to look at a little differently as to when the log was cut and when the log was actually used in the building. And that's one of the things that I mentioned about the dendrochronology studies that they're looking at as well, is we can find out usually during the season that the tree was cut down, but was that the season that the building was actually built? What it usually gives us is a date that it can be no later than that, period. Okay, yes?
One more question, and then we're going to turn the lights on, and you can ask Ben questions while we eat, okay?
Isn't that green lumber theory, isn't that why they have those big long adjustment bolts in current structures?
In modern log structures,
Yeah.
yes. But of course, in historic structures, we didn't have that.
Right.
We didn't use that technique.
My last question is, I said my last question. I was under the impression that when the pioneers came in, they were in a hurry. And so who had 3 years to wait for lumber to dry before they were building a long structure? That's just sort of contrary to
Popular belief.
Well, yeah, and what we are now beginning to realize is that when, and I had some other pictures, I just couldn't get them all on this presentation, but it's a very good picture of a settlement family that's moved into the frontier. He and his wife, and they're with their horse and their children, and they have constructed a lean-to log structure, and it's just to get them shelter long enough to then start working on constructing a much more substantial building. And so that was more than likely the case. Well, those lean-to structures or the saddle notch round logs that you can usually build in a few days could provide you a structure, but are not going to last. And that's the reason why we don't see them surviving at all.
They were taken down and made into a
Used
corn
in
crib or
something
something
else.
like that, and that, nothing was wasted, but they had to have a temporary structure, and it wasn't a log house they lived in.
Many of the people who built the bigger log houses had already been here 2 or 3 times on long hunt trips and had circled the tree they picked out. This is where we want to go, and they had cut the bark on the trees, and so it might be 2 or 3 years later before they came and took the tree down. But it was a long planning process,
Right.
and a lot of that drying took place there, and that that we had lots of groups that came, and where 200 to 400 men came, primarily chasing the Cherokee down to Louth. But they cut timber and prepared it for when they came back,
Yeah.
and then fought each other.
Yeah, and there's documented proof for that as well. So that, yes, that's very understandable, and that they would have done that because we have written documents to that effect. Yes.
Blunt Mansion lumber was sold in that method. When was Blunt Mansion built? In Knoxville.
I don't hold me to this, but I think it's around 1800.
All right, because there was a fellow named Martin that talks about them having the lumber.
Mm-hmm.
And Colonel Martin, who was on Washington's staff, came to Wildwood, where Porter is.
Mm-hmm.
And the Martin House is still standing. It's got poplar boards, 24 inches wide, and I went out there with the brother of the Blunt Mansion curator, and he'd been involved in that sort of stuff in New York, and he said that it was the same log marks, saw marks on Blunt Mansion and on the Martin House. The family has not done anything to the Martin House, and every year you think something. I'm with the museum, and folks are always wanting to getting some money and then fix it up, and I ask them if they got $2 million to start. And if they have, then we'll try to put a committee together.
Yeah.
But if you don't have raising it $10,000 at a time, it doesn't work. Now,
Right.
I know that the house up in the Carter House, the state gave what, $100,000 grant 20 years ago to get started with that.
I administered probably back in the 80s.
It made
Close to-
gray hair
yeah.
as gets the time
Yeah.
goes on it. It was a beautiful house, but those were supposedly the 2 first sawed houses,
Mm-hmm.
and they were evidently sawed on the same saw mill.
Mhm.
There had been some stories that lumber was brought in from North Carolina, but it's been pretty well accepted.
Yes, and that's one of the parts of history that we sort of have to sort of just not take for granted, but sort of take for, well, maybe we don't know everything about that yet.
Well, I fell through the floor of the kitchen, like the busted the knee up going down.
Well, the fact that lumber, I think one of the things about Blunt Mansion that I sort of smile greatly at is the fact that one of the docents says that the window glass in the house was the first window glass that was ever used in the state of Tennessee. And we know that's probably not true. The window glass in early houses were very prominent. And as I said earlier, in Jonesboro, glass was coming in along the wagon road very early. Even though we didn't have any glass factories that were making glass, blowing glass here in the state, they were bringing in window glass very early. As a matter of fact, as I said earlier, when you were here as a colonist, you were working for the crown. You worked for the crown. The land you lived on, more than likely you didn't own, but you produced things. But what was happening was, this was a colony, and the colony was to support the economy of the mother country. And so the raw materials that were coming from North America, coming from India, coming from South Africa, coming from Australia, all those colonies were set up to send raw materials back to the industrial base in England in the 1600s, in the 16 through the 1700s, up through the Revolution, up to the Revolutionary War. And so that was the whole point of these colonies being set up. We sort of lose sight of that by the time the Revolution comes back. Our mindset goes back to, we have freedom here because, we don't really understand why we didn't have freedom, and at a time period when we didn't have that. And so, as a subject to the crown, you did not have the freedom that you have today. So the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States are so very important that most of us don't understand what it really means unless we go back and we look back at what it was like before this happened. And so that's where our freedom actually comes from at that point in time. So one of the things that I was going to say is that the products that were shipped to the New World, or to North America, were products that were made in England and then shipped as a sellable, taxable product to the colonies. Some products were advantageous to do that with. One thing that they allowed the colonists to make was window glass. But you could not make any kind of container. You couldn't make a glass or a pitcher or a bottle or anything of that nature. The Crown didn't allow you to do that. But they allowed you to make window glass. And so they set up early window glass factories in Connecticut, Massachusetts, to make glass because it was so hard to ship it across the ocean. It was shipped in barrels in straw to allow for some packing, but still there was so much loss of the glass, they decided that it wasn't feasible to continue to ship it because they were losing so much of it. So they allowed the colonists to start making their own glass. They also allowed the colonists to start iron processing. But once again, it was to ship back the raw iron back to England and not make a finished product. They wanted to make the finished product in England and sell it back to the colonists. And so, once again, that's the type of mentality and understanding that we often forget about our early forefathers.
Is your home eligible for historic status in the National Register?
No, because it's been moved.
Because it's been moved. And the Ogle cabin that you mentioned on in the park, the Bud Ogle cabin, do you have any insight in that? It's a saddlebag.
Yes, it's a saddlebag house.
The left half was probably built first, and then the other part has the leans over the
And saddlebag houses were built both ways. As a matter of fact, the house that Randall and I, the building that Randall and I are working on for the Sam Keller house up at Townsend in the Heritage Center that we put in there, that was a saddlebag house, but it was built at two different times. As a matter of fact, the portion that we were able to save was even moved from another location to the location and put up to create the saddlebag building.
And how about the original Martha Jane Husky Ogle cabin? Do you have any particular comments about it?
I'm not as familiar with a lot of those. I mean, I've seen them, but I don't have any history other than, just don't have that kind of experience with it.
Something that the gentleman said about coming early and cutting the logs goes along with what was told, saying that William Billy Ogle cut the logs, then went to South Carolina where his family was, and then the plan was to come back later. So that's why I understand it now for the first time why that would happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, going in, that whole concept that we have of going into the frontier and with an axe and start chopping down the trees, and then within a few days, you got a log house built. That's really didn't happen.
All right.
But, so.
And the lifting of those logs must have taken a number of men or
Oh yeah.
pulley or something.
Before we had access to the cranes and the pieces of heavy equipment that we used to use, we did it all by hand. And when I was at the University of Tennessee, I had a professor by the name of Dr. Newbert Riedel, and he was in charge of the cultural anthropology department, in which I was part of. And so he was able to acquire a building out in the little Tennessee River area that was going to be in the inundated part of that. And so he was able to acquire that building, and he wanted to know, could we go get that building and bring it to Blunt Mansion? And I said, well, yeah, we can, but we're going to have some help. And he said, well, I got plenty of help. So we got a class of about 20 students, and that summer we went out and we took that building down by hand with 20 male students, with ropes and struggling and everything else. But we didn't. He was able to get a piece of equipment to get the logs from the ground up onto the trailer to move it to Blunt Mansion.
And that's a sense of how it was in the pioneer days.
That's how it was.
Yeah. And it's one other thing. Oh, I noticed the tall building, multiple stories, and then also the tall furniture. Was that typical? I mean, that was a very tall piece of furniture.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that we also find that's sort of contrary to what we think about when we think about a log cabin. A log cabin with a very low ceiling, low doors. We think everybody was shorter back then.
Yeah, right.
It sort of gives us that impression. And there were a lot of those buildings built. But what we're finding is that those types of buildings with those short doors and short ceilings were later constructed buildings. They weren't the earlier buildings.
Right.
When we're getting them dated now. We're looking at those things, and they're sort of leaning toward the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And why that was done that way, I think it was just strictly because they needed a building at that time that would serve as a shelter. And that was the quickest way they could get it done.
Well,
and we see a lot of joinery in those buildings, where the joinery is separating. It's no longer sitting tight with each other.
Right.
And a lot of them have rotted corners where the water was able to get to the interior because the joinery technique and the skill level was not there in order to do it. We see logs that are hewn much rougher with just the felling axe, and not really the skill of a broad axe being used to finish off the interior of the walls to make them nice and finished, which a finished wall log is going to repel moisture a whole lot better than a rough log, where the water has a tendency to get to the inside of the log. And so once again, it becomes a building that won't withstand the weather nearly as well.
Well, the park buildings are, at least the Bud Old cabin is a lower ceiling one. But instead of having a second floor, they did have the attic room, the loft room.
Right.
To, I guess.
I was going to talk about that, but my wife is looking at me saying, you're taking too much time. So.
Well, evidently we didn't mind at all. We were glad you were here and spoke as much as you were able to. Thank you so much for coming.